Thanks for joining us today. I'm going to talk to you about a collaboration that started in the spring, mapping a historically African-American neighborhood that was demolished in the 1960s near the university. This project was motivated or informed by a larger series of projects around mapping race and housing that have been ongoing right now. So some of you are going to be familiar with these. The Mapping Inequality Project at the University of Richmond has mapped redlining and the prevalence of redlining in neighborhoods across the country. The Mapping Prejudice Project at University of Minnesota has been doing a crowdsourced effort to identify restrictive racial covenants in housing in the Minneapolis area and trying to reckon with that history. And then you see universities specifically dealing with their histories of enslavement or profiting from enslavement. The Universities Studying Slavery Consortium is one effort toward that. And so this project kind of sits in that realm. More specifically, I'm talking about a collaboration between the Community Mapping Lab at University of Georgia, and particularly a class that I teach called Community GIS, and the Linnentown Project, which is seeking to bring up the history of this redevelopment that you'll hear more about in a second. This Community GIS class has been ongoing for several years. We usually do some kind of collaborative engagement with local groups around issues of common concern. It's an upper level class, so it's a mix of undergrads and grads, more undergrads than grads, but a mixture of both. And it assumes that people come in with some existing GIS expertise. The goal of this particular collaboration, you'll hear more about it in a second, but it's basically to digitize some historical or archival records that were present along with in the university special collections library, along with looking at some oral histories from residents and doing some summaries of that data, digitizing it, doing some summaries, and then doing some analysis. And we'll talk more about that in a second. Before I get too much further, I'm going to pass the baton to Miss Hattie Whitehead, who's a former resident of Linnentown. She'll give a little more background on the neighborhood in this project. She needs to unmute.
I'm muted.
There, you're good now.
Okay, I just want to thank the whole team for putting a map together. It's a visual that we have never had, and we have been speaking from memory. So thank you. But like Jerry said, that I'm Hattie Thomas Whitehead. I'm a first descendant from Linnentown. Linnentown, I want everybody to know, is not listed in any documents for the University of Georgia or the City of Athens as a community. Our community was made up of 3 streets. 2 was not paved and 1 was partially paved. This community was 4 blocks from the University of Georgia Stadium. It was on 22 acres of land. By 1960, there were about 37 Black families that lived there. It had reached 57% home ownership through hardworking people that made meager wages of $8 to $10 a week. It was prime property because it was only 4 blocks from UGA, and UGA wanted this property to expand, and they wanted it cheap. So they collaborated, the UGA collaborated in partnership with UGA with the City of Athens to get approval for urban renewal. They got approval for urban renewal. And once they got approval for urban renewal, it was the university's responsibility to get us moved out of the community. And that led to terrorizing our community in order to get us moved. Some streets were blocked. They were closed off. Big ditches, open ditches were dug in front of our homes and left open at night. The equipment was started up at 12 o'clock at night, so we could not sleep, and came close to some of the houses that we were still living in. Some of us were still living in. We saw neighbors' houses that were burned, and we also saw neighbors' houses that had been pushed down. So it was hard for us because we were born and grew up in Athens to be treated this way, but we were not treated fairly at all. And all this led to our community being erased. It was completely erased, which is sad, and that's why we're thankful for the map and what your team has done.
Okay, thanks so much, Hattie. So my name is Aiden Hysjulien. I was one of the students in Dr. Shannon's course last semester, and I'll be briefly just going through the various data sources we digitized to create the layers for this mapping project. So really the foundation of our geographic data was a set of historical maps provided as scanned images by the University of Georgia Libraries. So we began by georeferencing these maps and then just tracing the topology for the buildings, parcels, and the street network as it existed at the time. In the process of this, we also brought in any relevant attribute data from the maps themselves. The next set of data we digitized was the household level removal records that were created as a part of this urban renewal project. And it was really these records that provided the basis for much of the attribute data for our maps. Some of the data that we were able to include from these records involved detailed information about the people living in Linnentown, whether they're renters or owners, the condition of their houses, how much people were compensated, and then where people moved as a result of this displacement. The next set of data we digitized was the 1940s census. And so by creating a digital record of the census and deriving some XY coordinates from the addresses, we were really able to build out and do some more preliminary analysis and get a better understanding of some of the longer history of Linnentown prior to renewal, prior to this sort of small snapshot that so much of the other archival records were from. The last set of data we digitized was gathered from conversations that we had with the former residents of Linnentown themselves. And as we talked with residents and we presented some of the preliminary maps we had created, we really quickly learned about many of the features of Linnentown that had just been left out of the record, or that the people creating these maps as a part of urban renewal didn't see as relevant to the social life that was going on in Linnentown. And Jerry will talk about this a bit more detail in a minute. So in thinking about how we came to digitize this data in a class of 20 plus people and do this collaboratively, we really ran into a lot of challenges associated with trying to undertake this as a group of 20 plus people. Some of these were very simple things like, what file format should we save everything in? How should we name our attributes so that we can bring them together in a pretty straightforward way? Other challenges that were much more complicated came from some of the imprecision or incompleteness of the historical record. So one example of this is when we were trying to draw out the topology for the parcels, we really had these main two maps to work from. But once we drew it out and looked at them together, we noticed that they had some pretty important divergences from one another. So then it came to a matter of bringing in aerial photography of the past and the present and street networks and trying to come together and look at all of these things on top of one another to really try and collaboratively figure out the representation that we all felt like was the best and most accurate possible that we could. So I now want to pass things back off to Jerry.
Thanks. So one of the other kind of key challenges that we wanted to highlight here is that there's another kind of triangulation that needed to happen here between the records and the accounts that we had from former residents. And to illustrate that, I just want to highlight one of the key questions, which was, where was Linnentown, right? If we looked at the original records, we have a boundary that looks something like this. These are in the record. This is a scan map from the records that were held in special collections at the library. But when we sat down and did sketch mapping with former residents, they highlighted all sorts of little ways that this map was really inaccurate. That the boundaries that defined that neighborhood, particularly around racial segregation, were much more kind of nuanced than that. There were streams, there were fences, there were paths that helped kind of define the boundaries of that neighborhood in a different way. And so this was always a kind of recursive or iterative work in progress. So that we move from a map that looks like this to a map that looks like this. And you can see how the boundary And our final version of the neighborhood is much smaller and tighter and much more focused on the area that residents identified as being this community that, as Ms. Hattie said, is used to exist primarily in their memories, and we're trying to take some of that and put it on a page so it's easier to share it and to talk about. This project ended up we just spent a lot of time digitizing in the middle of lockdowns and all these kinds of things, but students did do a set of presentations and online projects giving an initial summary or analysis of these data. We use StoryMap that you've heard a lot about already in this session, as well as Tableau to do that. I have some snapshots here just to get a sense of what some of those projects look like. One of the major findings we got from that was, for instance, the change in home ownership between 1940 and that 1940 census data and the data in 1960, that it increased substantially during that time, which really adds to this issue of dispossession and really highlights how important that was. So from there, I'm going to pass it to Joey Carter, who's going to talk about kind of where this project is at and what's next on the docket.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Joey Carter, the project coordinator and a local labor organizer. And what we've been doing with the project right now is working with local elected officials to draft legislation that allows the residents of Linnentown to seek proper recognition and redress. That is, it's a reparational form of legislation. And a part of those demands in the legislation is to propose a history center funded by the city and hopefully the University of Georgia. And included in the center is these maps. And this is why working with Jerry and Aiden and the students has been so incredibly valuable for the organizing, because this helps the stakeholders and decision makers understand what's at stake and understand what the recognition and redress has to look like. And it not only allows us to address this in terms of reparations, but it also gives residents themselves a way to articulate their histories in ways that they haven't ever been able to do. And that I want to pass that over to Hattie to talk about how the maps play a role in the book that she's writing on the neighborhood.
Yes, thank you. These maps will help in the book that I'm writing, it will help the readers to have a visual to understand, as I explain about the community, to have a visual to see what I am talking about. So it will be good to have in the book, because this is the only other way, this is the only visual that they will have when I'm talking about Linnentown, where it was and how it was laid out. So I'm grateful to have that. And also I hope, as Joey said, that this map will be in the History Center if we can get that approved in Athens one day. So I'll pass it off to whomever.
Yeah, I'll finish this up here, finish this out. And I just say, like, it's not just the maps, but it's also the data. I know we're wrapping up here. Right. That we're doing some analysis, like, for instance, trying to understand what was the scale of difference in the money that residents who were in predominantly white areas received versus those who were predominantly Black areas. There's some more analytical parts of this too, and we're mapping in multiple different ways. So thanks, everybody. There's contact information here for me and Aiden. You can contact Hattie and Joey at the Linnentown Project Gmail that's up there. There's also a couple of websites. So the main project is redress@forlinnentown.com. The Community Mapping Lab site also has more on the projects that students did, including their presentations at the end of the semester. So I believe we're taking questions on Slack, but I appreciate your time and your attention. It's great to share.
Thank you. Thank you.